What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I am the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, here to talk about the fact that patch 14.1b is already live. As I mentioned in the previous patch rundown and preview, we expected to micropatch. We built it yesterday. I, in fact, recorded a patch preview on yesterday evening. My power went out halfway through the recording, and I didn't want to start over again. You know, for me, halfway through is a decent amount of time, so I just didn't want to do it. But the patch notes are live, so I'm going to record a patch rundown. This one is not going to have all the data tables. I'm going to go for a somewhat speed run version of the rundown. We'll see how it goes. Let me know how you like the video. Anyway, 14.1b is out and live for a server near you. A lot going on. Okay, so there's I actually want to skip past champions initially and talk about the fact that the way we're doing this patch and the way we orchestrated it was we did systems first. So I want to talk about, because a lot of item changes, and there will be more in the next couple of patches as well. I want to talk about why and how we're going to be doing item changes according to the item balance framework that I was tasked with making, and then it more or less got approved, and so is what we're going to be working off of. And the core thesis is to balance systems first and then balance champions downstream of the systems. What that means is when we look at the patch, we say, oh, wow, look at all of these health AP champions, Vladimir and Gwen and Rumble and Singed, and basically a whole bunch of mages who don't want ability haste are all winning. It'd be very, very easy to say, oh, well, we're just going to nerf Ryleys and nerf Riftmaker and nerf Liandry's, and we're just going to nerf all the AP Bruiser items because obviously all the AP Bruiser champions are overpowered. I think that is the wrong approach, because what we should be targeting, and what we are targeting, is why the patch is built this way. It's correct to say that our changes systemically buffed non-haste AP champions. Like that's accurate. And if we're like, well, all we're chasing is win rate, then we would just nerf those items back down. But the goal is to say, no, we actually want to make sure that Riftmaker feels like a good item, and Liandry's feels like a good item, and Rocket Belt feels like a good item, and Storm Surge and Ludens and all these other things feel like good items. And as long as that is true, we will then individually balance champions. So that's the goal here, and it's why I'm actually going to skip past the champion, start with the system changes first. But it means that, yes, we have to do a bunch of champion changes, and we're leaving Riftmaker roughly where it is. Now, again, there is a chance Riftmaker is a little bit over. One way of looking at that is, okay, if we're going to look at Singed and Rumble and Kale and these champions, are they prioritizing Riftmaker over other options, right? If it's clearly down on all of them, then that item is a little bit over. Now, to be clear, we're not targeting Riftmaker as the same pick rate as Storm Surge. There's way more champs who want Storm Surge than want Riftmaker. That's fine. We're not going for every item has equal pick rate. It's, okay, this item has been designed. Are the users appropriate? If so, the item is balanced. Let's move forward, right? And if it's the users are inappropriate because it's getting over-purchased compared to other options, then it's overpowered. If it's getting under-purchased, is it not exciting or is it underpowered? And so I'm not going to spend too much more time on that one, but that is the thesis, basically, of item balance. Let's scroll past the champion updates and go into item updates. Bunch of champion buffs, bunch of champion nerfs. Here we go. Okay, so it's kind of scattershot. I think it's alphabetical, whatever. Okay, so first up is Essence Reaver. Essence Reaver was nerfed because my understanding, I was not directly involved in this, but we had a bit of direction, or I should say the seasonal pod had a bit of direction around item gold efficiency and trying to keep things within a relatively normal ballpark. Now, Essence Reaver is one of the most gold efficient items in the game. Most marksmen, though, don't want sheen patterns, and those who do don't typically also want crit. Sheen and crit have literally no direct synergy whatsoever. They don't even often work off the same stats, since, sure, they both care about your base AD, but crit often cares more about your bonus AD because you're trying to go for as big of damage multipliers as possible. Attack speed cares about one and not the other. Ability haste cares about one and not the other. These stats are entirely unsynergistic. It's the same reason why items like Rageblade have to be really, really gold efficient, because like attack damage, ability power are not synergistic in any way, in the way that like health, ability haste, and attack damage actually are. Fighter items have stats that are all synergistic. You care about all three. They all reinforce the exact same thing in a multiplicative manner. Sheen and crit do not do that. Now, my current thinking here is that I think Essence Reaver needs some work in order to open it up to feel good for Ezreal and Corki. I believe the right version of Essence Reaver is an item that Gangplank, Ezreal, and Corki really like, and then probably Lucian comes along and is pretty happy too. And if we want to really overtune it, we can maybe have Xayah or Kai'Sa maybe care. And it's like a fringe option. I'm not sure about that. Ashe could probably do this. Ashe has a low cooldown spell that follows up the auto attacks. I could see that one coming out here as well. Regardless, that is off topic. I don't want to spend too much time on off topic stuff. Anyway, this is coming in saying, yes, the gold efficiency is going to lie. That's fine. We tried the experiment really quick. Let's not do that too much. It's good as a decent ballpark of like, hey, let's make sure our item's in a pretty good spot, but it is not the rule zero of item design, and so I'm happy to have us break away from gold efficiency, though it's a very, very good first step, but it is ultimately not sufficient for item balance, and that's fine, but just wanted to kind of bring that up. That's my understanding of why the item got nerfed initially. It only has Gangplank as a core user. We're buffing it back up. And the nice thing is, and I sort of nudged the designer who did this work a little bit to say, hey, I think we can buff it above where it was pre-patch. He agreed, and so he did it. Gold cost is back down to where it was before 14.1, but also a very small 10% base AD increase on the item. It's not a big deal. I'm actually glad he's doing the non-scaling version. Marksmen already scale off gold plenty well. They don't need to systemically have extra bonus AD ratios on the items they buy. I realized that I redesigned Kraken Slayer, and I gave it an AD ratio. I'm trying to help us undo that. I think it was a mistake to give typical crit marksman even better gold scaling than they already have. I think their kits are sufficient for this. Regardless, directionally, I like both of these changes. Again, I think there's more work to be done on Essence Weaver, but for now, Gangplank's clearly happy. Corki and Ezreal probably do not switch over. That's okay for now, but again, something I would like to have work be done on. Next up is Heartsteel. It basically doesn't have any users where it's 50% win rate first item, considering tanks should be relatively fine. Now keep in mind as well, it's not like Heartsteel is going to be good on Akali or something, I hope. Like I'm hoping. But regardless, the point is to say that, well, if Kayle and Singed and Teemo and Gwen and all these champions are overpowered, and they're eating all the winner of top lane, every other top lane gets a depressed win rate. So a Heartsteel tank, for example, has to fight Gwen and fight Kayle and fight Singed. They're going to have deflated win rates. This is why there's no way we're getting the balance perfect on this patch. We're not going to have perfect on point 2, we're not going to have perfect on point 3, but we're going to incrementally get closer and closer to a good balance state. This will take time, but this is our first step in getting it in the right direction. So in a way, we are not only nerfing the opposition of Heartsteel, but we're also buffing Heartsteel because it statistically doesn't seem to perform very, very well. So great. It's hard to demythic an item and have the balance be perfect. Here's a nudge in the correct direction. We'll continue to collect data. This item might need more. It might be overpowered somehow. That's fine. We'll keep moving forward. 100 health, though, is nice because it not only is the item is better to the tune of 266 gold worth of stats, but also bonus health from items feeds into the damage of the Heartsteel proc, which then feeds into how much bonus health the item gives, which then feeds into the next Heartsteel proc and the next Heartsteel proc. So there is a chance it's a very, 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 I don't want to say subtle, I want to say impactful balance lever. This might not be too much, but either way, it is a buff and a deserved one as far as I'm concerned. Hubris is definitely incredibly weak. This item does not have many good users. Hubris will probably have a measured incredibly high win rate if players use it like they use Magi's, where they only go in when they're snowballing and want to keep snowballing. The tough thing about Hubris is you have to shot call it pretty hard. It's not like buy a Dark Seal, get some stacks, okay, let's go Magi's. It's, okay, I want to know it's Hubris time, and then start building statues. Like that could be a tough call, right? But I think if players are intelligently saying, oh, I'm snowballing, I'm going to go Hubris, we should expect to see a very high win rate on this item. If players don't do that and they just buy Hubris every game, then we won't see that. And we have to, look and see, right? The win rate is going to be very much inflated or deflated by player behavior, of course. Regardless, its win rate right now is completely horrible, and this is not just because Profane Hydra is kind of bad, so absolutely valuable stuff here to get this item up. Pretty large buff, of course. Great. Profane Hydra is one of several Tiamat items that is not doing very well. Profane Hydra, Ravenous Hydra, and base Tiamat are all getting buffed in this patch. Profane Hydra is a basically core first item assassin item. The only champion where this item has a high win rate is Rengar. Rengar loves Profane Hydra. Okay, fine. But Kha'Zix, Zed, Kiana, none of these champions are successful on Profane. This item clearly sucks, and so we get 100 gold off the price, and we make the cleave active, do more damage, and I'm kind of happy. My personal suggestion was to have the execute threshold start at half health instead of 30% remaining health. This helps it be a lot more readable and understandable about when to optimally use the active. The designer agreed. That's cool. I'm excited to have that one in. But item cheaper, item does more damage, and item does more damage more frequently. Clearly some pretty big buffs. Are we going to get 3-4% win rate off this buff? I'm not sure. That might be roughly what we need. But again, keep in mind that we're buffing things up that are having to face overpowered things. And so there is a little bit of double dipping going on where if we nerf Storm Surge or we nerf Kayle or we nerf Team or whatever, and then you also buff the item you're playing, you're moving in both directions, right? So there is always a chance we overgo it here, but whatever. Ravenous Hydra, a small buff. This one is less underpowered than Profane was. 2% lifesteal is not huge, but certainly meaningful. Going to make the item do its unique thing better. It's one of very few lifesteal items in the game. This is a very good change by the designer, making the cast time take as long as your attack timer would be, your total swing timer, which actually means someone like Corki, for example, would cast Ravenous Hydra much faster than a champion like Rumble. Not that either are going to build Rav Hydra in the current version of League of Legends, but Corki actually has his attack frame is twice as fast as Rumble's. Anyway, I think it's reasonable that it has some cast time. Typically, Rav Hydra users are not going to be stacking a ton of attack speed. I think it is good that there is some animation here, but clearly was too slow, clearly felt bad. Smart buff. Stridebreaker, definitely probably the single biggest losing item of the patch. I got demythicked and lost just a ton of power. This item thankfully has a decent amount of health, which I'm happy about. I was actually just talking with the designer on this item, or one of the designers who's on the fighter system, and he was asking if I thought the item should have its damage back. My personal belief, interrogating it only a little bit, this is not like 100% for sure my stance, but it's my first instinct here, is I think this item should probably just be a Tiamat item and have the Tiamat passive on it, and we don't have to increase the damage beyond what Tiamat does, but just it shares so much of the structure of the other Tiamat items that this is a slowing Tiamat, I think is reasonable. I think Stridebreaker and Ravenous being unique because they're both Tiamat items is fine. Basically, only Rek'Sai is a Titanic Stridebreaker user, and even then that's a pretty uncommon combination, but she's like the only champion who kind of wants both of them. So I think that would be reasonably safe. I know it technically reduces some choice structure there because you're not allowed to buy them together. Regardless, I think it is a big satisfaction one for the thing to have an active. Maybe we'll do it in 0.2, maybe we'll do it in 0.3, maybe we won't because there's good reason not to. Regardless, it's a random thought. Either way, this item was really, 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 really poor, and so we acknowledge that, okay, it's really, really bad, 5 attack damage, 5 attack speed, and a small increase to the unique, giving 35% instead of a 30% to the slow and bonus move speed. Okay, great. As mentioned, Tiamat getting a buff here as well. The designer on the Tiamat system, his opinion was that Tiamat was also bad. Trusted him on it. If I like incredibly strongly thought Tiamat was OP, I probably could have fought him for it and maybe had this not go through. I trust him though, and ultimately the total attack damage of the active goes up from 60 to 75% total AD. Okay, fine. Cast time goes after the auto attack cast time instead of 0.25, much like the Ravenous Hydra change. I don't feel much better. Okay, great. You know, pretty significant buff to a I don't know how good this epic component is, to be fair, but regardless, again, trust the designer. If you think the item's weak, sure. Item nerfs, of course, in here as well. Not only buffing a bunch of stuff that wasn't doing very well, but nerfing some stuff that was doing a little bit too well. Hextech Rocket Belt, I thought, had a fairly reasonable set of users. It was definitely rather popular. The designer on the mage system thought that Rocket Belt was OP. Happy to trust him on this one. He's going to spend more time thinking about mages than I am. So he puts in the suggestion. I'm like, okay, cool. If you believe it strongly, you know, I basically just say like, hey, I don't think we have to nerf this. He's like, no, I think it's OP. I'm like, okay, cool. Trust you. Let's go. And so 50 damage off the flat. I think it's actually very smart. I am generally a fan of having as little systemic damage as possible where it's not needed. In some cases, like Storm Surge, the entire point of Storm Surge unique is the damage. There's almost nothing else going on. It has to be good enough to be compelling. The thing about Rocket Belt is mostly about the dash. The damage needs to be enough to feel like the bolts actually exist and they matter, and that dashing forward is better than dashing backwards. All those things I think are fairly relevant. Of course, you can dash backwards. There's cases where it's fine. All that said, totally reasonable to lower the active here because I think it's still going to be plenty good as an item with 50 less damage once every minute-ish when you're actually dealing damage with it. Storm Surge, of course, is OP. Storm Surge, last I checked, was the single most built item in League of Legends, and it's just like Yeah, less systemic damage. Mages themselves have more AP. They already have more burst damage as a class of champion because of the other item changes, because of structurally how much ability power and ability haste and magic pen you get. All those things are very reasonable. So lowering the amount of burst in the game, also very, very reasonable. Once we get enough data, I'll start looking at reports on time to kill. If the game actually is meaningfully more lethal than before, if it is, we can do a pass on overall lethality, on overall burst damage, and ensure that, I mean, again, the goals were literally make mages more bursty, and in fact, in fights where you're fighting Annie or LeBlanc, your time to kill is probably going to be a bit faster. That's just going to be true. That's okay. But if every other class is also killing faster, then again, we can find ways to systemically siphon damage out of the game. Totally reasonable, right? I would like it is one thing that I do want to do this season is try to maintain a relative level of normalcy around overall damage in the game, and this might mean we have 2 or 3 patches where we nerf a bunch of runes or nerf a bunch of item damage or whatever, right? But like efficiently keep damage at the right level. That is one thing I'm going to keep my eye on this year, and just kind of letting you know that's what's going to be going on. Regardless, I think in this case, nerfing some Storm Surge unique passive damage is really reasonable. Goes down by about 20% is roughly the math here. Okay, great. Collector, definitely one of the big winners here. Collector, interestingly, it's weird how I said earlier where Essence Reaver, which is Sheen crit, doesn't have any synergy, but Collector, which is lethality crit, actually does. Because lethality actually multiplies crit damage. It's a like lethality, the stat, or any kind of armor penetration is a strictly multiplicative. It is a multiplier on damage. So it's actually very easy for lethality and crit to be good stats together. And of course, there's a slew of marksmen who are fairly caster based. You look at Jhin, you look at MF, you look at Samira, you look at Neela. These are all champions who like Collector. Yeah, it's a good item on them. Ultimately, this item bit OP gets nerfed. Keep in mind, one of the other big system changes of 14.1 was converting lethality to a flat stat instead of a level scaling stat. So unsurprisingly, lethality on bot laners, which is the second lowest XP role in the game, gets a lot better. Who could have seen this coming? So indeed, great. Yeah, one of the more expected systemic results of the game is this. Okay, we can nerf the item back down. Not a big problem. Great. It's Collector is OP for about 3 days. It might still be OP. Okay, fine. Yeah, it's okay. Again, we'll keep our eye on stuff. If we have to nerf specific champions, we will. Not a big problem. Titanic Hydra, definitely one of the big winners. Titanic Hydra actually didn't have a really, really large pick rate. My belief is that this item would catch on over time. I was willing to entertain the idea of leaving the item OP and letting players catch on. I think that could have been an acceptable choice to say this item is going to be OP, players catch on. I did that on purpose with Spear of Shojin back in whatever, point 17 or something, and it caught on, and then I nerfed it to the appropriate amount, and then Jace's pick rate on Shojin kept climbing when Shojin was objectively weaker for him than before the changes. But it being OP for a patch would require players to realize, oh, this item's good, I should start buying it now. And of course now Shojin's a new item, but the item was shattered for a long time and no one bought it. And I was like, okay, well, can you remember this item exists, folks? And then they started to. So there's validity in doing this. I think the sanctity of things being theoretically balanced is less important than the game being good. And one of the parts of the game being good is, to some degree, it's not the number one thing on the stack rank, is people buy different items from other people. It's the reason the item system exists, is to create some extra variance and have different kinds of strengths on different champions and whatnot. Anyway, Titanic Hydra is overtuned because this micropatch will be functionally live for about 11 days until 14.2 runs around. The concern was that this would catch on and degrade games because the item is very overpowered. And so it's okay, yeah, players haven't totally caught on yet. They probably will. Regardless, let's ship a nerf. And I think it's reasonable. So attack damage down by 5, health down by 50 is a very big nerf, but again, this item is very overpowered. Trailblazer, speaking of very overpowered, probably one of the, probably the other, strongest item in League of Legends. I actually think Titanic Hydra and Trailblazer are literally the two strongest items in League of Legends on 14.1. Not anymore with 14.1b. But Trailblazer was crushing in terms of support pick rate and win rate. This item is clearly very, very, very good. So health goes down by 50, gold cost goes up by 100. The tough thing about Trailblazer now is you do not gain a single stat for combining it now. You just gain the unique passive, which makes this item very tough to tune because all we have left is then nerfing the unique or making it more expensive. And this is a support item, so making it above 2500 is not the greatest. It's okay to have greed buys. I think it's reasonable to say, hey, this is a greed buy. You have to be ahead to buy this, or just delay your spike. And like that is a reasonable thing to do as long as we have enough items to say, like, here's the greed buys, here's the not greed buys. Now, to be fair, we probably also need another greed buy if we're going to like really maintain this as a thing we're going to do. That's a tough call. That's tough to do. I don't think we really have those right now. But probably there's maybe a little bit of space in the system for some more greed support tank buys. I don't know. Regardless, item very overpowered, needs the nerf, totally fine. Alrighty. Some patch note corrections, some bug fixes. Yeah, there's an Ivern bug fix here. Cool stuff here. Let's scroll up then and now talk about the champions. I ended up running the balance meeting for our Micropatch, and I basically wrote in, we like had our targets of like, here are the items we were going to consider buffing and nerfing, and we accepted probably about half to 3/4 of them and ended up doing work on them, as we just talked about a second ago. I went through, and for all the champions we had also written down as things we wanted to discuss for possible buffs and nerfs, I wrote in for each of them, here are the items they are commonly buying, aka these are the items affecting their win rate. So if we have a champion and we're buffing items that they're buying, or he's a champion and we're nerfing items they're buying, it's like, oh, okay, let's keep that in mind, and we'll act as a result. So generally speaking, the things that I put into the document, I can't speak for what everyone else had as their theories, were basically champs who were above 53 or below 47% win rate. Last season ended with every champion being between 53 and 47. I think every champ being within plus or minus 3% of 50 means the game is incredibly well balanced, and anything where you perceive like a low amount of win rate, you can make up for in champion mastery in every single case. There's not a single high mastery champion. There's not a single champion in the game that's not crested 50% win rate off of just champion mastery. Every single one crests it with enough champion mastery. So if you're like, my champion sucks, like, well, if you're practiced, you're still better than your opponents. Yeah, it requires more mastery in some champs than others. That's just how the game works. Whatever. I don't want to dive into that topic too deeply. Anyway, again, I just said, okay, let's try to bring things that are outside of plus or minus 3 into plus or minus 3. Took an assorted set of champions that we thought were already pretty good or pretty bad, and like gained or lost like at least 2.5% win rate, and tried to bring in those as well if we thought they were like decent and became bad, or were decent and became very, very good, even if they weren't like above 53 or below 47. Opportunistically grabbed things that sort of I thought moved enough where even if the win rate didn't say they were extremely an outlier, my belief was they were an outlier and should be brought in regardless of what the win rate data said. Okay, so first up is Corky, who we had just made good in the 24B Micropatch, and he, much like Ezreal, you can see on your screen here, lost a ton of power off of Trinity Force. Now, I actually wish I had nerfed threefold strikes harder. The thing is, I was happy with Triforce because it felt in like after point 10, it felt appropriately strong on fighters, and so I really didn't want to nerf the item, and I would have rather just nerfed the marksmen who were abusing the item, because Triforce was finally good enough to be good on Jackson, Fiora, and stuff, and was like a actual common item again. And to me, like, that was correct to say that, hey, you can buy things that aren't just the healing ones, Gore Drinker and Divine Sunderer. What I kind of failed to realize was so much of the item's power was in threefold strikes. I did change it around a little bit. I made the stacks, stack much more quickly, which I thought fighters would, not get to attack as much. But I should have nerfed for threefold strikes, maybe buff something else about the item. Ultimately, the only thing that really happened to Triforce in 14.1 was it lost threefold strikes, and everything else was like pretty close to the same. Of course, there's no longer Divine Thunder eating its lunch, but like almost always the same item outside of threefold strikes. And Trinity Force is like totally fine on Jax, totally fine on Camille, totally fine on Fiora, and like those champs are all like basically fine. And it's just like, ooh, the Triforce 80 carries all suck. Draven moved over to playing Collector mostly, and a little bit of ER, but like Corki and Ezreal are just trash now. It's like, okay, I don't believe we need to buff Triforce. I think its set of users is fine. It's bought a reasonably normal amount. Back in the olden days, Triforce was like a load-bearing fighter item because there just weren't a lot of good fighter items, but we have a lot of good fighter items now. And so Triforce is going to be one of many. It probably won't be the most built fighter item, and that's fine. It will just have its set of users who really like Sheen patterns, and great, we get to move on from there. So from what I can tell so far, it is reasonably balanced. It might be slightly weak. We might buff Triforce at some point, might even nerf it technically, based on what we end up seeing long-term with data, but like the item is not so clearly weak it's going to be Micropatch buffed, and so we didn't. And it doesn't mean, though, that Corki and Ezreal lost a ton of power. I'm going to buff them. So I did the Corki changes in the last patch. I'm doing them here as well. I am trying to once again close the gap on Corki mid versus Corki bot. And my goal here is around 2.5% win rate. That is a pretty lofty buff goal in a micropatch, but that's roughly how much power I think Corki needs to get to his old Triforce first win rate. Now, Triforce is still Corki's best item. It's still not particularly close. Triforce Manmune is still his build. It doesn't really have any other options right now. Again, would like to buff ER and put him in a spot where he can use it, but we're not there yet. I also, while I'm here, want to buff Corki as a bot laner. Now, Corki is a very unpopular champion, so there's very, very limited data, but as of the current patch, with, again, quite a lot of variance because there's not a lot of data, Corki bot lane is at about 1% win rate of Corki mid lane, which is great because it was like 3% off before. And so it meant that, some mix of 0.24B, some mix of micropatch stuff, and hopefully these teams as well can put Corki in a pretty good spot. Corki bot lane has never really been a huge problem. Corki mid lane, of course, has been pro-jailed before, but that's usually been AP build. That's why I'm only buffing his attack damage, and I'm not bringing back AP Corki. I'd be happy to delete his AP ratios at some point, because we're, I think, generally not really willing to maintain AP Corki. The gameplay is really degenerate. He's a very, very safe poke mage, and it's just like not particularly exciting for players to deal with. Whereas Corki is like totally allowed to, I think, be a very solid sort of mid-range with some poke marksman and feel cool about it. He gets to be one of the caster marksmen. That's neat too. And so it's buffing level 1 stats, so less reliant on stat growth, and buffing rank 1 and rank 2 AD ratio on the ultimate. These things are going to buff bot lane more than they're going to buff mid lane. Then they're going to buff mid lane, right? Bot lane Corki is going to be level 6 through 10 a lot longer than mid lane Corki. Is going to be 11 through 15 a whole lot longer than mid lane Corki. Probably the entire game. Very rarely to get 16 on a bot laner. So he doesn't even hit the break even point on the ulti, whereas mid lane Corki more likely will. So we'll see how the win rate goes. Obviously, this could be too much. If it is, we can nerf him. It's fine. We'll have enough data to probably know. But I think at this point, it is worth considering playing some bot lane Corki here. Ezreal, I tried to find things that were interesting. My first instinct, by the way, right now, when I'm doing buffs, is I look to see if durability can be something that we do. Now, with Corki, I'd already buffed his durability in 0.24B to say that actually, Corki, Valkyrie forward plus using E, I would like you to be to have stats a little bit closer to Tristana, where you can feel like you want to W forward onto the enemy face, press E, and then auto-attack them 4 times. They have the same pattern. It's great. I love both these champions, by the way. Tristana and Corki are 2 of my favorite champions. So happy to have them, be able to go ham and have high for a marksman durability, as long as their poke pattern is not so good that they are durable and always get away with pressing W. Now you have enough durability where you can press W forward. Ideally, that's what I want out of these champions. So moving in that direction, already buffed Corki's durability in a previous patch. Ezreal has this kind of pattern as well. If you land W, he can E forward and play aggressively. Oh, neat. But I look at Corki's stats. I look at his overall champion base stats. Like, actually, Corki's already, or Ezreal's somewhat already on the relatively durable side for a marksman. I don't feel comfortable making him even more durable, but I will always look at that first. But Ezreal's durability seems to be pretty fine, so I don't want to push him. I don't want to get in a weird spot where, like, marksmen start getting close to Mega Knight levels of stats. That just means things have broken down. I would rather systemically fix these issues than, like, power creep exactly one class of champion, right? But it's like, okay, well, these champions are low win rate. Now, to be clear, I think like the goal for Ezreal is to get him around like 48.5, maybe 49% win rate. He is a fairly high mastery champion. He is a little bit harder to play than most other marksmen. He's, top half in that regard. You will generally tend to see this champion is going to observe a lower win rate because he's asking for higher mastery. That's totally reasonable if Ezreal is below 50. That's totally fine. He was exactly 50 across the lifetime of 13.24, which is interesting. He should probably sit around 49 or 48 and change. And he would be a totally fair champion with that. Because again, just get good is a reasonable thing to ask of you. That said, since Ezreal does not get to be more durable, I don't think it's correct for him. I wanted to give him something interesting to do, which is cast your W more often in lane. A shorter cooldown. Now, it's not going to be less mana, so if you actually spam W on cooldown, you can yourself. It's only 50 mana, but like, you can before you buy tier. This isn't irrelevant, but you can fish for W more often, and then if W lands, you still have to capitalize. You still have to press E, or get in a range to auto attack, or line up a Q past minions on them. So I think it's great that Ezreal gets to have a more active game plan, right? I want that. I don't want this guy to be, oh yeah, I just sit back in lane. I'm ultra weak side safe guy. Now he's still going to be that. Ezreal is just like the giga weak side bot laner, and that like pretty much can't be untrue. Outside of like Ziggs is better at this. And maybe Karthus because he can actually get the wave when getting tower dove. But like whatever, right? Ezreal, let's put more of his power into, but sometimes play aggressively, very reasonable. And so it's saying you can fish for W more often, but you still have to land it to do anything and burn a cooldown to do anything with it. And then eCost just says, yeah, I think the cooldown should be long. He refreshes it with his Q. He obviously gets a lot of haste in his builds normally. E being low cooldown is just a scary thing. Like, this should be a meaningful cost in terms of when it's down, you should play around it. I'm a very big fan of actually having meaningful buttons on champion kits having long cooldowns. I mean, we lowered the amount of ability haste in League of Legends in 14.1. I actually believe we can nerf many cooldowns, just cooldowns, the base number, in League of Legends, and make a better game where there's just larger windows of things being unavailable and playing around them in the way that people play around Flash, very obviously. Things like Ezreal E have a long cooldown, and intentionally so, and I want to preserve that. So said, okay, well, mana cost is an easy... I landed the W, cool, 70 mana to go for with E. The cooldown's still there. That window's still out there. You can go for your Flash Leona combo. But it's going to, cost you less to just do it up front. It's available more often. Or available with less cost. Okay, moving forward. Hui did have a pretty meaningful bug but we looked at the data, and there was a bug with cast at max range, locking out his E permanently for the rest of the game. This seemed to have had a very, very small impact on his actual performance. That bug, I believe, has been fixed or will be fixed soon. I don't know which. I have not been up to date on that one. But Hui's win rate itself went down about 3% on the patch. And this was a champion that I thought was going to be sitting at around like 46, 47 on day one of the patch, and that to me was going to be fine for Hui. He's at like 44 or something. I actually have public data open on my other tab. Yeah, he's actually sub 44 day one of the patch. It's like, ooh, this champ should get about 3%. Like, I expect him to be starting the day at 47, not starting the day below 44. This champ should be buffed. His win rate by week is slowing down. I think he's getting less than 1% per week now. We'll see what happens in pro play. My understanding is LEC is playing this weekend, not on the Micropatch. So, I mean, we'll see if they want to play minus 2.5% win rate way. If they do, oh boy, figuring out Pro Jail is going to be an experience. But again, 44% win rate this late into his release, multiple months at this point. Not something I'm personally a fan of having still happen. So buff him up, even if people can eventually get there with Mastery. For the sake of his teammates, let's go. So, reasonably high health growth now just says, yes, you could be more durable. Now, keep in mind, one of the things about Hui is his spells are really not guaranteed. Basically, everything is dodgeable. It's not quite as easy to dodge as someone like, let's say, Brand, where I think Brand has really, really low agency. But Hui is not an ultra-high agency champion. Like, he's not as high as Ari, certainly not as high as someone like Yone, where he really can't force you to die. His stuff is pretty fair. He requires a lot of skill, but he's also pretty fair, which means this champion is the kind of champion that I think, as people master him, is allowed to have a relatively high win rate, and is not going to be terribly frustrating. Now, one thing that did happen is this champion, because the game's overall ecosystem moved toward higher AP, less haste, anywhere where Hui has kind of bad AP ratios relative to the base damages were things that I nudged the designer toward buffing, and so indeed buffing the AP ratio on QQ. It's a small touch, but it does do something. This is a primary spell. It has a low cooldown. This does matter because this gets repeated quite a lot. And then a pretty significant level scaling boost, plus 10 to 30 damage on every E-spellbook spell. And then a really big one is actually the diameter of the R missile is going up from 80 to 90, which actually does, to be fair, increase its reliability somewhat, right? If you make the spells more and more reliable, we can eventually table flip and this guy can actually be an agency monster. I don't think we're there. I don't think this does it, but because of how much the R requires other setup, the designer's saying, well, actually, let's give him a little bit more selfish. I can just throw out the R and get some value. I think that's reasonable. I, again, trust the designer on this one. So that's kind of the logic behind the buff. Lux is one of many support mages who lost a ton of win rate, but Lux was basically the only support mage who wasn't above 50% win rate. Brand, Zyra, Xerath, Vel'Koz, there's probably a couple others. I think Swain was only 51. But basically every support mage was incredibly high win rate and often prevented us from easily buffing the champion in other ways because it was going to make them a 55% win rate support. And it's yeah, we can't do more than this here. So for the most part, a bunch of support mages lost a ton of power and they're still completely fine in most elo brackets anyway. So it's like, great, slam dunk. We now have more room to give someone like Heimerdinger buffs if we want. Or, to be fair, Heimerdinger is currently kind of shattered. But like Brand or Zyra, okay, Brand's fine in the jungle, so like we're chilling, but like Zyra, etc., Xerath, Vel'Koz often have been ceilinged in some cases by their support power level. Cool, we have the room, which is kind of nice. Lux, however, below 50, right, lost a lot of win rate, right, and as the single most played support in League of Legends, impacts a lot of players. Now, I don't think we need to get Lux back to like 50.5 in support by any means, but considering that Lux mid is much like Brand, cannot force you to die, like her skills are pretty fair. Lux at 50 is a champion that we are consistently waiting to buff in mid lane, but can't because she's already a very popular and relatively highly banned support. Once we finally got the bandwidth, because Lux is 48 support, we're like, oh my gosh, we can finally buff this champion. We can give her 2% win rate and put her at what we think is a much more reasonable win rate in mid. After all, if we were saying that yes, Zed and Yasuo and Yone should be 48 or 49% win rate, someone has to have that winner on the other side. One of these champions, I think, is deservedly Lux. So that's like the logical explanation of why she can be above 50 in mid. Someone has to eat the win rate somewhere. We think Lux is one of the more fair champions to be a strong performer in like sort of observed game win rate, right? So base health up by 20, base armor up by 20, right? When we have the ability to go for durability, we do. I didn't do this work, but very big fan of the designer who did it this way. Attack speed growth is mostly feels, not a ton of power. We did a lot of buff like this back in 0.21 or something, or 0.22. We gave a lot of mages a bunch of attack speed, and it was very low win rate impact, but feels great. So since Lux has an auto attack pattern in her kit, go make it better. I'm a big fan of throwing this just like at every mage who can use some win rate and just use some feels. It's not a ton of power. It feels great. And then saying, okay, let's not go up with burst. In fact, you already have great burst items with Storm Surge and whatnot. So let's just keep going for durability outputs. And so indeed, we get a very generous, this is a very, very good AP ratio, a very generous AP ratio on her W. Next is Naafiri. Naafiri lost a ton because her suite of lethality items did not go very well. Now, there is a possibility that she is still incredibly good on New Eclipse, and that Naafiri is overpowered on New Eclipse with these buffs. There is a chance, if data comes in and reliably says that's true, we can nerf her back down in 0.2. But with her lethality builds, they're all trash. And at the time of doing this patch, there was not enough data on Eclipse to be confident that was actually true. But there's indication that it might be true. Regardless, still pulling the trigger here, and Naafiri kind of sucks. So yes, we're buffing Profane Hydra, we did that, but we thought that she could still use more even after the item buffs because there were a lot of other builds that still weren't looking very good. So 5 base move speed is pretty powerful. Get some doggo damage back and a little bit of doggo cooldown as levels 9 and onwards. So not going to feel it in the early game, but a little bit of late game insurance off of having some more dogs. Not much else to say. Some buffs in a Fury. Zac appeared to be a very big loser on the patch as well. One of the theories is just, well, his 2 core items, which were Radiant Virtue and Demonic Embrace, are gone. He has to find other builds, and they're just not quite there. So we gave him some cooldowns back. The designer believed pretty strongly that Zac needs to have somewhat shorter cooldowns. Now, the E cooldown is going to be very, very hard to use. You're often not cooldown gated by this spell. I mean, you can be. This doesn't have 0 impact, but it's not the kind of thing you're casting multiple times in a fight, like, say, a Darius Q. It's just hard to get your second one in a lot of cases. Can matter, though, of course. And then the R cooldown gets to line up with other tank ultimates a little bit. I think it's reasonable to go down to this case, though, again, I'm a fan of having fairly long cooldowns. Again, but systemically, that can be a different discussion at a different point in time. Regardless, Zac lost ability haste in some of his builds, so again, I think it's reasonable. And the more spicier change, because we needed more win rate magnitude than just these changes, was to go plus 1% on the passive heal per chunk. This is going to be very, very meaty. This is a very, very big deal. These slashes, by the way, are based on R rank, so levels 1 through 5 goes from 4% to 5%, and level 16 plus goes 7 to 8%. Again, very, very meaty change. I think this might be a lot of power. I don't think Zac's going to be incredibly overpowered. It's entirely possible. We can different point if that's the case, but that's the change here. And then Zed, and again, another big loser. All of his power was in the old Ravenous Hydra that worked on spells. That is gone. He's got to find the new build. Doesn't have one yet. We're buffing Profane Hydra, but we think he's still far below the line. This W change means basically nothing. This is once you are champion level 14, a quarter second on W. Yeah, that's not a big deal. You max W last. It is correct to max W last. People will continue to max W last because the E rank is getting better. 0-20 flat damage on E. And the more fun one, in my opinion, I suggested doing an R buff. And the designer said, yes, I agree, let's do it, is a total AD ratio buff on R, which is both a base damage and a gold scaling buff on the spell. This item does this much total AD plus percentage of damage dealt. So R gets to be more reliable. Zek gets to have a better ultimate. Cool beans here. I think if we actually put more power into Zed's ultimate, we could maybe try to push him back toward pro play. I think it would take a lot to really get him there. But I think a reasonable lever is individual ult cast power is somewhat pro skewed because ult is slower paced, and so more of their fights have ultis available, and so a stronger ultimate tends to lightly skew toward pro. I'm not saying a really big ulti, suddenly big Zed ulti makes him a pro play pick, but it at least nudges us in the direction. I think it'd be cool to get, the Faker What Was That plays again, right? That'd be kind of sweet. So then it's time for a slew of nerfs. Aphelios, of course, not using basically any items that we're nerfing in this patch. He only buys Collector a little bit. He's much more commonly buying Kraken Slayer and Stormrazor. I actually looked at the data around his skill maxes, and maxing E is only like a couple fractions of a percentage higher win rate than maxing W second, in E second versus W second. The win rate of Q max into W max also went up like 2.5% this patch, so something specifically Aphelios happened this patch. I didn't see any bugs with him. It might be that there is one. Regardless, the champion is clearly doing very, very well. And essentially, look, Aphelios is already an incredibly good late game champion. He currently, I think, does the second most damage of any bot laner, like by end of game in League of Legends. I don't know who's first. I just know he's second. He was fourth the previous patch. Yeah, he's still going to be a high damage champion. I mean, he has basically no utility. He has purple gun sometimes, but like, whatever. This guy's a damage champion. That's fine. But anyway, this champion is doing too well. And it's like, okay, I'm going to take a pretty easy nerf here. I know roughly how much impact attack damage growth has. I've done it several times with Corki and Jinx and whatnot. And essentially, Aphelios will still be a very good late game champion, but if he has late game some, because making him even weaker early game is, I mean, he already scales up to the right really aggressively. He can scale up to the right a little bit less, and he'll be like a 48.5% win rate champion, and that's probably fine. Aphelios, of course, is much like the Ezreal case, is a very high mastery champion. I need to be like, I want to reiterate this, like, players should not conflate win rate with their actual power. Win rate is the observed performance of players playing League of Legends. If players are bad at their champions, that's going to deflate win rate. When Faker flash insect ruler by predicting his flash, Azir's pick rate spiked and his win rate plummeted. Azir did not get weaker because Faker killed ruler. Azir performed weaker because bad Azir players started playing Azir. You will see this with resting win rates on high master champions like Aphelios and Ezreal. That's how this works. So yeah, when you see Aphelios at above 50% win rate, it's like, wow, this champion is shattered because people suck at him and he's winning more than half his games. Wow, he's better than every other AD carry. Moving on now is Fizz. Fizz is a champion who does not need very much mana. He loves Lichbane. He loves burst damage, doesn't really need ability haste that badly. So, of course, unsurprisingly, when you buff a lot of the no mana items, Fizz is very, very happy. He also really loves new Lichbane. Lichbane was a pretty bad item, and now it's a good item where a decent number of champions might want to buy it. Fizz already liked Lichbane. Now he's great. We're not nerfing Lichbane. Lichbane's appropriately balanced. Fizz used Lichbane, is now overpowered. No surprises here. Of course, with burst damage is very, very good. And we're specifically targeting spells that already have incredibly aggressive AD ratios per base damage. You can see here, right, Q and W, compare the AP ratio to the base damage of the ability, and it's like, oh, these are really, really, really strong AP ratios already. Yeah, they should go down some. So they are great. Fizz probably still going to be very, very good, but goes down some, very reasonable. Interestingly enough, these are also things that will like basically apply Lichbane on their own, right? If you're using the W active or the Q, that's an auto attack proc, so it's like directly compensating the stronger Lichbane, which again I think is very reasonable. Gwen doing exceptionally well, was one of the big winners because she absolutely loves the new mage ecosystem, doesn't need mana, doesn't need ability haste, she wants to hit you with high amounts of ability power. We know that her passive is an incredibly fickle lever, so a pretty light touch here, but yeah, there's a ton of power here. There is a chance it's too much, of course. That's entirely possible. If it is, we'll buff her back up. That's not a problem. Regardless, the champion is, of course, doing incredibly too well, and so she goes down. Kayle, much like Gwen, really likes the new AP ecosystem. Similarly, with you having more AP, feeling good about your builds. Now, I do want to point out one thing, though, which is Kraken Slayer, Rageblade, or like a Nashor's Rageblade, or Kraken Nashor's are all builds that Kayle's doing very, very well on. So, this will have a little bit less impact than you might think because she can simply side grade her build. It might be that Kayle needs other nerfs. She's still going to be a very strong performer. Kayle, though, does seem to be a champion who can sit above 50% win rate without having too many complaints because she doesn't really ever force you to die, and you have kind of all the tools in playing against her, and people don't really seem to mind champions that they can bully in lane on average. So it's kind of champion that like can kind of be allowed to eat win rate, and it's sort of okay. Regardless, of course, again, Kayle doing too well, goes down somewhat. Sadly, AD LeBlanc is back, so we go back on the old changes, which is the attack speed ratio goes back down to Senna tier. Attack speed growth pretty much makes up for it. I rounded up. This is slightly better, technically, her attacks per second before and after, but of course, if you buy attack speed, if you buy static shift, if you buy Storm Razor, it's getting worse than before. Also, her like attack damage usage as a mage doesn't matter. As an auto attack champion, it does. For a conventional marksman, 0.5 AD growth can be about 1% win rate. Combined with the attack speed ratio, this is probably 2 to 3% win rate. AD LeBlanc should be pretty dead here. I do want to point out, though, that AP LeBlanc seemed to lose some power on the patch. As a core Ludens user, that seemed to have a pretty big impact on her. Overall, though, just, yeah, seems to be... She lost about 1% observed win rate on AP builds from what I could tell from cursory data inspection. And so buffing some AP ratios back up, because this doesn't mean nothing to AP LeBlanc. It means very little, but it doesn't mean nothing. And so moving these up. Basically, these are her weakest AP ratios. This is, by the way, both halves of Q. So if you trigger the mark, you will get a 10% AP ratio increase. And if you land E1, you'll get a 5% AP ratio increase. E2 still does twice as much damage as E1, basically. Singed, another winner as a champion who clearly does not want ability haste and very clearly likes Riley's, Leandry's, Riftmaker, that whole set of items. He's very happy with all three. His AP ratios have been just in the freaking stratosphere as a result. Now, I do think Singed needs to have relatively high AP ratios, considering he has to be literally melee range to get damage on this thing, and he would want to build tank oftentimes when that is the case. Regardless, this is still a very, very generous AP ratio. It's fine to have this. You know, I don't think it should go down to like 50%. I think it would be just too low. We should never go that low on him unless he has incredibly like huge other changes to his kit. Regardless, again, massive winner. I think the highest winner champion on the patch, I think it was like 58% or something incredibly ridiculous. We're not nerfing his items. This is a pretty hefty nerf, of course, with primary damage tool. We'll see. I think he's probably still going to be one of the strongest champions, but we can act again and point to if that's the case. Taric, a big winner. Ultimately, tank supports ended up being the ones carrying the dub this patch. He likes New Cheaper Frozen Heart. He likes New Cheaper Fimbulwinter. He likes Trailblazer. All these are very, very good. He was the one making out the best. Making out like a bandit. There we go. Anyway, yeah, he was making out the best this patch, and so needed a nerf. I am a little bit loath to nerf a tank's overall durability, though ultimately he got better durability. He got better tank items, and it's reasonable to go down this path. Didn't, again, have to be this direction, but I think it's reasonable to say that you literally have better tank items that you already buy. The stuff you already bought, like Fimbulwinter, just got 200 gold cheaper. We're going to compensate you a little bit. I think it's reasonable to do, to be very clear here, right? So, all right, champ goes down somewhat. Seems fine. Teemo, again, another big winner of he doesn't need mana, he doesn't need ability haste, just wants to deal damage. So the just direct spell damage goes down. Q's AP ratio is still solid. R's AP ratio goes down a very little bit. It's not a big deal, but hey, the traps being less annoying, I think, is very reasonable to make the traps less annoying. I think it's totally fine here. Yeah, we'll see. Again, Teemo, we can see him go down a little bit further, but at least it's, under from the right direction. And that's the patch. That's the patch. We got under an hour because I did no numbers changes. I didn't do the graphs and the tables and whatnot. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time. Bye-bye.